We are 12 minutes ahead of the schedule, which is not a problem since the time management is quite flexible due to the lunch break after that. It's my privilege to introduce our first plenary speaker of the Hungarian National Educational Research Conference, Markku Niemivirta from Finland. It has been a long tradition at these conferences that international scholars make their contribution to the success of the conference by means of giving a plenary talk or keynote address. Markku Niemivirta is still from the young generation of European researchers on the field of learning and instruction, but having seen that the youngest author of the last year conference book was born in 1997, I changed my mind. This was the year when we first met with Markku in Athens at the European Association for Research on Learning and Instruction conference. And during the decades when we met, there was one always presenting boomerang topic for us. It was the research methodology of educational research. So having seen the affiliations of Markku and having seen the great number of research topics on which he had numerous contributions in the form of scientific articles mainly. So research methodology is always there. The soundness, the trustworthiness of educational research depends on the research methodology we use. So if anyone would like to label a researcher by means of the main research topic, we might say that Markku Niemivirta is a motivation researcher, but it would be too simple to claim. So the other topics are somehow related to motivation, self-regulation, of course, achievement as a field from the cognitive sphere, and well-being, for example, a new territory of scientific endeavor. He is now simultaneously at the University of Oslo and the University of Helsinki, so he's quite accustomed to traveling across time zones, and he was very happy to get up early this morning and to give us his plenary talk. Markku, the floor is yours.
First, of course, some technical issues. I'm a Mac user, and usually we're not very liked in occasions like this, so let's see how things go today. If you want to sing or something while, that's fine. By the way, you have to remember that when we met in Athens, we were hardly teenagers. So let's see. First of all, I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me. Very honored. It's always a pleasure to come to Hungary. I've had some very good colleagues here for several years and really enjoy the hospitality of Hungarian people as well as the food, which is plenty. usually. Okay. So this will be my topic today. I will provide some background for the idea from the research on students' achievements. I think most of you are aware of the quite nice success of Finnish students in PISA. Although the last round was a bit disappointed, I think we dropped a couple of positions in the ranking, which of course caused a crisis in Finland. But by the way, Finland was just appointed as the happiest country or nation in the world, also besides the PISA success, which is something that nobody in Finland understands. But we'll be happy about that. But that attitude shows something about the other side of the success that is very relevant in Finnish discussion. And it was right after the last round we found something like this. Those are pieces from the news in Finnish, unfortunately, that came to the conclusion that the Finnish students are the least motivated. You can't probably apologize for the quality of the slides, but you should see that Finland is the bottom right there of the OECD countries in terms of motivation. So the conclusion was, yeah, success, nice, but. And that was one of the points of discussion immediately in our context. But if you look at the results a bit more carefully, this is how that indicator was measured. That's the items. I'm not sure how well you see them, but that provided the context for the comparison. And there you can see the OECD average and the level of USA students on motivation. Now, if you compare Finnish students, it's understandable that they are very low. They are quite far from the average and especially from the US level. I'm not sure if that should be the comparison, but it was one of the highest anyway. But for me, as a motivation researcher, that's really how I identify myself. The question for me was this: is this exactly what we want when we talk about motivation? If you look at the items that was used to measure achievement motivation, they refer to social comparison, being better than the others, being on top, being the best in a very competitive way. Is that the kind of motivation we would like to see in the students? So that brings me, this sort of debate and the discrepancy in looking at these issues brings me to the topic today. How should we understand the striving for achievement, and especially, is there a price for success? For this discussion, I will show you a lot of results from research, and I try to do it in a graphical way, so it will be as straightforward and simple as possible, and I will try to do it always in the same way, so I will use standardized scores and so on. So I hope you're comfortable with graphics instead of a lot of writing and numbers. But to frame my perspective and the research that we have done in our research groups on these issues, I will first introduce you a model that sort of frames our research as well as thinking about these issues, as well as talking about these issues to educators and practitioners. So I will introduce you to a very simplified version of a model that I wrote together with Professor Monique Bukarts quite some years ago. I was still a teenager at that time, as we already realized. So that you can understand the viewpoint into the different results that I will be talking about. So at the core of this model is what we call situational appraisals. That refers to our interpretation and experience of a situation, that interpretation that we make out of the situation. For example, for me, this is quite nervous, anxiety-provoking, also a bit exciting, of course, but because of my personality, I find it very stressful. I'm an introverted person. I don't like people very much. I don't like new situations very much. Sorry about all that. But that influences the way I perceive this situation. So one key factor contributing to those situational interpretations are what we are in terms of individual factors. But of course, that's not all. It's always in a context, so also the situational factors influence that. Again, in this situation, your responses, your reactions are a very important factor that contributes to my interpretation. There's always people sleeping. There's always people showing sort of annoyed expressions. Some are more interested, more excited, and I detect all that in a very automatic way. And that influences the way I experience the situation. So that results in this framework, the motivational sort of preparedness or situated motivation in this particular context. It might raise my interest, it might enhance my self-efficacy or not. It might provoke anxiety in me. So basically, the core of this model, besides those situational appraisals, is the balancing between two different types or modes of activity. Of course, it's not that simple. There's not just two routes that we choose or accidentally go to, but that illustrates the idea. The other one is what we call a task-focused activity or route, which means that when things go smoothly, when our interaction is positive in the sense that it doesn't provoke too much anxiety in me, or something that prohibits me from doing what I'm aiming to do here, then I'm on the task-focused route. But again, if people start leaving, start booing, that happens every once in a while, or reacting in a way that provokes anxiety in me, I might end up in a different mode of activity, which is what we call the emotion-focused activity, where the focus is on maintaining my well-being, feeling good about the situations. So I might try a joke or something else to change the mode of my behavior that might then influence your reactions. Whatever, I might do whatever it needs to restore my sense of self in that situation. So basically, what we're talking about is the balancing between two types of activities. In the school context, it's quite common to see these different reactions and that interaction. So we might, every once in a while, or the students might be in that well-being route where things do not go smoothly, or they might fluctuate to the task-focused activity. But usually it's waxing and waning between these two modes. Now this model or these ideas form the basis for what we have done in our research. It's not always explicit, but it's always there in the way we think about these issues, theories, constructs, and so on. So if I want to conclude the whole idea here into few sentences, that I also, when I communicate these issues with educators, this is what it would be. Few arguments. From the perspective of the student, learning and performance situations are always more or less some sort of coping situations. They need to survive, in a sense. And although these different situations might in principle be similar, there are always subjective from the student's point of view. One size does not fit all in the classroom. Students perceive teachers' behavior in their own way. I will illustrate this idea from the research perspective with one design that we used a while ago, where we looked at the situational motivation part, then we had a task, and then we looked at how the students perceived the task and the outcomes of the task. So it was operationalized in a way that we had interest, self-efficacy, and self-handicapping. I hope you're at least to some extent familiar with these constructs. If not, feel free to ask me to clarify, or if you don't see what it says on the slide. Then we had actually in this task, we had a complex problem-solving situation, a dynamic task where students were interacting with the task. And then we asked how the students felt or experienced the task in terms of few relevant issues. In this case, those are example items where the student were responding to. I didn't understand the task, I did well, I didn't even try. And then we wanted to see how these things predict each other over the course of the task. As I said, just an example of that dynamics. So what we found was this interest and self-efficacy predicted task performance, and what is not seen here is that we controlled the task performance with relevant knowledge in this area. So it would seem that that situational motivation had some added value in terms of the performance. And self-handicapping, which refers to providing excuses for possible failure, like I have a headache now, it probably influences my performance. I don't have a headache now, so I hope that relieves me in my performance. And then if we look at how the task performance influenced these post-task attributions after controlling for those situational motivational factors, and what we saw that the students' performance, and they did not know the performance level themselves, so this was the factual performance, had a negative effect on their sense of not understanding, and positive effect on their perception of success, and a negative effect of not trying. But what is more interesting is that whether those situational motivational factors independently influence those attributions, showing that there's some individual components that bypass, in a sense, the performance, but influences the way that we interpret a situation. And what we see that there are some effects going directly across the task. So, just as this was not like, these are the greatest results that we have ever received. Just an example of how we try to capture some aspects of what we claim in the model. So, to continue with those arguments based on the model, students' actions are partly determined by their subjective evaluations, what the situation requires, and whether they have what it takes. And if I wanted to put all this into one sentence, that's kind of frustrating that you have this model that you can write a book about, and then you can actually reduce it into one sentence. But I think this sentence would capture most relevant aspects of the factors that contribute to the dynamics in the model. So students' activity in a learning or performance situation, I like to separate those two because they're not the same. And I think that's an important difference, which I will show later today, is guided, supported, and constrained. That's also an important distinction. Guided, supported, and constrained by goals, a variety of beliefs and expectations about one's ability to control and successfully execute actions and to thereby influence the environment. So that's basically it. And now for the rest of the presentation, I will focus on certain constructs within I would say, this sentence that we have looked at in terms of their effects or developmental dynamics or interaction with each other and performance. So I will start with goals. Goals could be looked at from very different perspectives, and for this presentation I have chosen the perspective that we have focused mostly on, which refers to achievement goal orientations. There you can see the definition. It refers to individual differences in our tendency and preference for certain types of outcomes and goals, and even their consequences. And to make sure that you understand the framework, I will briefly describe you the different aspects of this approach. So we usually separate mastery goals or orientations and performance. As I said, learning and performance are two different things. Mastery, performance, and then avoidance. And of these two, mastery and performance refer to approach motivation, trying to achieve something instead of trying to avoid something. And in this model, which one of our colleagues politely labeled as the Helsinki 5, I'm very proud of that label, we have two types of mastery goals sets. This is something that we have had to debate a lot on, try to convince the reviewers, especially reviewer 2, on these issues, whether it is relevant and valid as a mastery component. So mastery intrinsic orientation referring to the goal and aim of trying to learn and understand, and the mastery extrinsic orientation, which refers to trying to or gain absolute success and knowledge. And the absolute part is relevant there because one of the most sort of classical divisions is the separation of performance approach and performance avoidance orientation, where performance approach refers to striving for relative success. So if we want to make the distinction between these two, mastery extrinsic refers to wanting to achieve as well as possible with no reference to the others. So I want to get an A no matter what the others get. But performance approach refers to comparative perspective into that. I will be happy with C if the other ones get less than that. So it's not about the actual success, not the achievement as such. And then the performance avoidance is the other side of that coin. Instead of trying to demonstrate competence, that's about trying to avoid the demonstration of incompetence. I don't want to look like a fool, so I do this and that. And finally, avoidance or work avoidance orientation, which refers to trying to avoid situations that requires excessive effort, or in general situations that are linked to achievement strivings. Some people exclude this component from this perspective, saying that it has nothing to do with competence. Well, I'm an educational psychologist. When I look at students in the classroom, there are a lot of students trying to avoid any work possible, and they're very skillful in that. So I think we would exclude something important if we didn't look at that perspective of motivation in the classroom. And when we measure these things, we usually use items such as these ones. So if you read them, I would guess that you all acknowledge what they refer to, what they mean. You're familiar, the idea, even though you might disagree with it. Said, no, that's not me. I know people doing that, or I understand the point, but that's not me. That exactly is the reason why we usually don't just look at individual orientations and how they influence or predict other relevant themes, but we look at the relative emphasis on these different orientations. So you might, at the same time, strive for learning, but you'd be happy if you didn't need to do that much work. It's quite rational in a sense. So what we usually do is we utilize what we call a person-oriented approach to looking at individual differences here. There's some formal descriptions of the approach. The idea is to focus on the value profiles, the configuration of these different orientations or patterns, if you will, not just individual orientations. So what we usually end up is a set of groups of students who represent different profiles of orientations that are, the students within the group are similar to each other, but the groups differ between each other. And usually we do it always based on the data, empirically, so we don't decide that, there's 3 types of students. We let the data speak to us. And we use the statistical criteria to decide which sort of model explains the data the best. Usually we end up with 4 to 6 groups, and of those 4 to 6 groups, usually 4 are very similar. Then there's some differences depending on the sample, the age, the educational context, the culture, and so on. But usually we find certain profiles that resemble each other across the different samples. So here's one example of an analysis where we found 5 types of students. And now, as I said in the beginning, I will show all these results in the same way. The results are standardized, so you can see the relative differences to the sample mean and then to each other across the different groups. So what we usually find is a group that follows pretty much the sample mean. It's like the typical student in that context, and that gives you meaning only if you know something about the actual scores. And that sort of profile usually refers to understanding and acknowledging the mastery aspect, but not wanting to do too much work on it, which would really qualify as the description of a Finnish typical teenager student. They do know what is required, but they are lazy as hell, quite commonly. And there's empirical proof to that. Then what we usually find is something we would like to see more, is a group of students who relatively emphasize a lot these different mastery aspects. Usually it's not a big group, unfortunately. And then we find a group that also emphasizes the mastery orientations, but at the same time emphasize also relative performance and social comparison. Then we usually find a group that specifically emphasizes those performance aspects, even with some combination of avoidance. And finally, way too large group in many sample is the one that relatively most emphasize avoidance. So these are what we usually find. Here's an example of findings from a Portuguese sample using different instrumentation. So different measurements, but still similar profiles. Another sample from Portugal, again, different instrument, but similar profiles. A sample that I included here this morning, it's very fresh, straight from Oslo, Norwegian sample using the same instrument, again, similar profiles. And we find this even in the first graders. And this is teacher evaluations, because we don't expect in Finland the kids to be able to read in order to answer the questionnaires. So teachers have evaluated the students, and we find the same grouping again. So it seems that there's something pretty much common across the students, almost irrespective of age, cultural background, and educational context. And this provides us with a tool to try to understand the differences between the quality of motivation. It's not just about putting effort to something. That's a lay people definition. How do you define? Well, when you really work on something, yeah, that's motivated, yes. But the qualitative differences in what you try to achieve in the educational context is very relevant. So let's see how 4 of these groups differ from each other, whether there's some added value in creating this typology. So there are 4 groups here that we labeled mastery-oriented, success-oriented, disengaged, which is not perhaps the best possible label, but shows that there's no specific emphasis on anything, and then avoidance-oriented. Now a series of results concerning these. What if we just look at their achievement? We can see a sort of clustering of these groups into 2. Slightly more competent students, the ones who are doing relatively well, not so much different from each other, and the ones not doing so much like that. So, in terms of that, not a huge difference, not a huge distinction. So if we look at some constructs related to educational goals and progress with those goals, study goals, progress and effort, and then a negative aspect of that, not really caring, a cynical approach to educational goals. What we see here now is similar between these 2 groups and more or less similar between these 2 groups, below and above the average. Again, not a big, huge difference. In terms of effort, very similar pattern, some differences in the level, but the pattern is still similar. And if we look at the negative indicator, cynicism, again, some differences in the level. That one is quite worrying, actually. But the patterning is the same again. So one might ask, so what's the added value? You just have better students and less good students. What's the big deal? Well, if we expand our scope of inquiry into something else than certain types of motivational constructs, we might see something relevant. And that's what we have done. If we look at students' well-being, the pattern is not the same anymore. Master-oriented students, above average, success-oriented, it's right there, hardly different from the average. Disengaged, slightly above average, and avoidance-oriented, well below average. So there's a slight difference now to the pattern. What about depressive symptoms? Less than average in master-oriented students, above average in success-oriented students, again below average in the disengaged students, and above in avoidance-oriented students. So suddenly, these 2 groups are more similar than previously when we look at different facets relevant in the educational context. And this also applies to emotional exhaustion. Whether the students feel that it's tiring and stressful and straining to work on school subjects. And here again we can see the discrepancy in the patterning. Now, these 2 groups, success-oriented and avoidance-oriented, have similar experiences in terms of that, although they're very different from the academic point of view. So if we want to conclude something from here, we can say that the strive for achievement could be associated with emotional exhaustion and stress, but not necessarily so. And the same applies to inferior school achievement. It might be linked to ill-being, but not necessarily so. And this distinction is very important. Now, since we seem to have 2 types of students that strive for achievement with slightly different profiles in terms of their well-being and academic outcomes, it makes sense to look at those closer. What makes them tick the way that they do? So if we continue comparing these groups, but just focusing now on these two groups that strive for achievement, if you remember the original question, then let's try to find out what makes the difference between these students. They both do well in academic sense, but there are differences in terms of their psychological well-being. What might explain that or help to understand that? So we looked at the reasons for these goals. Why exactly would you want to strive for learning and understanding, for example? And three most relevant reasons that the students gave when we analyzed these were interest, utility, and expectations. So there was a rather strong difference in how interest influenced the way the students described their goal striving. For mastery students, interest was the key, but not for success-oriented students. Both acknowledge slightly the utility, of course. It's useful to learn. Nobody denies that, except for the avoidance-oriented. They actually find it useless. And expectations is another important differentiating factor. Success-oriented students perceived that there were more expectations from the environment, surroundings, parents and peers. So that drove them to strive for mastery goals. The same with mastery extrinsic goals. Yes, it does validate mastery, but they have different view on whether it demonstrates competence. Mastery-oriented, not so much. Success-oriented, yes, it does. Do I gain respect from success? Mastery-oriented, not a reason for me. Success-oriented, well, yes, I gain respect when I do well. Reasons for performance approach goals: it improves my self-worth. Not a factor for mastery-oriented students. It makes me feel good when I beat the others, when I outperform my peers. Not so much for mastery, again, yes, for success-oriented, and again, the expectation component. So we start to see a pattern here as well. Performance avoidance. Incompetence or experience of that drops my self-worth? No, yes. Failure implies incompetence. For mastery, no. For success, yes. It's not about effort, it's about ability. Not failing, important, not so much. So the reasons for the same goals might make a difference here. It's not just about the goals that influence the activity, but also why we strive for those goals. So if we continue, how does the learning world operate? As I already said, is it the effort that influences achievement, or lack effort for lack of achievement, or is it the innate perspective of ability? If you're familiar with Carol Dweck's work on mindsets, that would be similar to that, incremental and entity theories of intelligence or ability. So both of these groups do acknowledge that effort is required, but the difference is here. Well, it's significant, not a huge difference, but still it's very illustrative. It's not the innate ability for master-oriented, but yes, it's more like that for the success-oriented students. Now that influences probably also their behavioral engagement in terms of whether they give up when challenges come. Well, below average in both groups, not so much though in success-oriented. Remember, these were the students who really did well, but still there was some hesitation in terms of commitment. And very important predictor is the fear of failure. Again, master-oriented, not so much. Success-oriented, yes. So this sort of implies also a difference in the perspective into learning and performance by the students. It's more about individual progress. In the master-oriented, more about social comparison in the success-oriented students. And this directly links the idea to how we look at perfectionism. Because one way to look at perfectionism is to look at the level of goals that they set, the standards, and how they feel about achieving them. Perfectionism is not about having very high expectations alone. The problem comes, or the phenomenon comes, when you're not happy with that. So you always think that you could do a bit better. So we wanted to see also how they relate, how these different aspects of perfectionism relate to achievement. Both have relatively high standards, not a big difference from the sample mean, but the difference again is in whether they're happy with the achievements. So there are more perfectionist students in the success-oriented students than in the mastery-oriented students. So to conclude these sets of results, differently oriented students have different motivational mindsets, referring to their implicit theories as well as different beliefs and so on. So what are the consequences of this in the short term? Now, if we want to combine these parts of the model in a sense. So what we did, that we made an experiment where we induced the condition of the task. It was a complex problem-solving task once again, but we only changed the instruction of what the task was all about. For the task-focused condition, we said that it's a new simulation that we use for mathematics teaching, and it's an exploratory task where you can try to find a solution. There's no exact right answers immediately, but you can explore the system. So we tried to make it as neutral but task-focused as possible. And for the other groups, we said that it's a new program or simulation that we use for mathematics teaching. And it's a good predictor of intelligence. It's a good predictor of their success in life later. And we will also put the performance on the wall after the test. So we induced social comparison and stress. Nowadays, I think the ethical rules might disagree with the design. We, of course, explained to students what the whole thing was all about afterwards. But we wanted to see whether that instruction influences students' situational motivation. So the task was exactly the same. What we saw that in terms of interest, there was a significant difference. The task-focused condition was perceived as more interesting as the performance-focused condition, even though the task itself was exactly the same. Also, in terms of self-efficacy, we saw a significant difference favoring the task-focused condition. And finally, in terms of how much the students were self-handicapping, we saw a similar trend, again, in the favor of the task-focused condition. So just the instruction, the way we framed the task, made a significant difference in students' situational appraisals. But what we are more interested in here is that whether that situational appraisal interacts with individual differences in students' motivation. In other words, do mastery and success-oriented students perceive and experience the task, the two different conditions in the same way or differently? So what we find was, in the task-focused condition, there was no significant difference in students' interest. But in the performance-focused condition, it dropped in both groups, but a bit more in the success-oriented group. So there's an interaction, but not a very strong one. In terms of self-efficacy, the situation is slightly different. Here we have similar level of self-efficacy in the task-focused condition, but a significant drop in the performance-focused condition, but only among the success-oriented students. As you can see, the task condition had no influence on the self-efficacy level of master-oriented students. Didn't make a difference. The difference was only on this group. And the same applies to self-handicapping, and even more extensively. So not a big difference here, even a bit favoring the success-oriented students because the self was not at stake in that condition. But when the self was at stake, It was a huge difference. Again, I can't remember exactly was that even statistically significant, but the interaction is huge. Again, basically only in this group the situation made a difference. So, the situation and context do function differently for differently oriented students. Now, even more importantly, what are the long-term consequences? That's a difficult task to look at because you would have to control a lot of things, but we have tried with several different samples and designs and different age groups. What I will try to do is to make it as simple as possible because we rely on growth curve models in these analyses, and if you're not familiar with that, it would take another presentation to describe the methodology. But the idea is that we can model based on repeated measures over time, two components: the starting point of the developmental trajectory and individual difference in it, as well as the degree of change over time in that trajectory. So when that is significantly positive, it means that on average, the students are increasing in that given construct, and so on. And we also see the level of individual differences in that. So I don't want to go into specific effects there. I will just summarize the results because when we looked at mastery orientation, we could sort of see a positive developmental cycle here, or indications of that. So if we summarize the results, the starting point at 9th grade, then over transition to upper secondary level over 4 years, we could see that the initial level was predicted by previous self-esteem and school achievement. And the starting point of master orientation at that 9th grade predicted increase in later self-esteem and satisfaction with life, referring to actually their educational aspirations, and decrease in depressive symptoms after controlling for the initial level. So it would seem that just the starting point, where they started in terms of their mastery before the transition to upper secondary education, had some positive effects. And what is more interesting is whether the change in mastery orientation had an influence on the later components after controlling for the previous levels. So what we found that was positive change in mastery orientation over time after controlling for the other components in the beginning predicted increase in self-esteem. Now there's some arguments whether self-esteem makes any difference. It is a bit tricky research subject, but it's an indicator that we could consider as one important educational outcome if the students feel good about themselves. Now, if we compare these with the findings concerning performance orientations, these were all modeled at the same time, even though I present them separately. We could see a slightly different pattern of results again. So the initial level of performance orientation was positively predicted by previous depressive symptoms and negatively by self-esteem, and it predicted decrease in later self-esteem. And again, more interestingly, change in performance orientation was predicted by previous depressive symptoms and predicted later increase in depressive symptoms and decrease in both self-esteem and satisfaction with life. So even more significant effects in terms of the developmental dynamics, or dynamics in the change over time. So again, differently oriented students seem to follow different developmental paths and cycle. And we're looking at that, the same issue with school beginners and following them over the years. And we seem to find slightly similar findings. Of course, the constructs are a bit different. We're not looking at depressive symptoms in young kids, but indicators that seem to reflect student well-being, nevertheless. Now, I could go on forever. I hope you still bear with me. a while, because then you might also start to wonder, well, what are the antecedents of all this? Where do these differences come from? Now, I could end up saying that I don't know, and that would be a valid answer. We really don't know that much of what results in these differences. But we have been interested in trying to detect some components that might be relevant. And one is temperament, which, depending on the perspective, refers to more biologically based individual differences, how we react to the surroundings and how we experience that. Here we looked at two aspects of temperament. Sensitivity to failure, in a sense. It's more inhibition sensitivity, so the sort of reserved perspective, being cautious about new events and people and so on. And then a more approach tendency referring to social reward seeking, enjoying praise from the others, because these are relevant in the educational context, especially in terms of the interaction with the teacher. So what we find here is something that resembles the previous findings on fear of failure, although this refers to a different thing. But again, that group is more sensitive to that. And also a slight difference in whether they seek approval. If you remember the reasons for goals, the expectations, and so on, this again confirms that sort of perspective in that. But we wanted to also go deeper. We wanted to see whether these differences in the sensitivity to failure might be detected already in brain activity. Because we know that the brain detects conflicts and errors, mistakes, very fastly and in a very precise way. So what we wanted to do is to combine educational psychological research and cognitive neuroscience, an idea that the neuroscientists are not really excited about, but I convinced them to try. And what we did, that we screened students first so that we could separate two groups. One that was quite extreme in inhibition sensitivity, and one that was not. So the not group doesn't represent a mastery group, but it is not certainly a group that fears failure. 5 minutes? Okay. I will run. So to confirm that we really had two different types of groups, we of course looked at the screening data, and we can see that the differences between these groups were very extensive on the same components that we had identified previously. So we put those two groups into the lab. And we've made them to do a task, a very simple behavioral task, where we induce errors. So we make them push a button every time they see a picture, and sometimes there's a distraction figure, and then they're supposed to withhold their response. And when you get that habituation, it's very difficult to stop doing that, so usually they make mistakes. And what we wanted to do is check what happens in the brain exactly at that time. Namely, in around 50 milliseconds after that response, the brain detects the error, but we become conscious of that around in 300 milliseconds. So we wanted to see that amplitude, whether there's differences. And then we wanted to see the later response to that, the correction of the error, whether there's a difference. And what we find that between these groups, there are differences in both of these. So in a sense, we could say that the brain works slightly differently in a situation where they deal with errors. Now, we can't say that this is a cause for anything. It might just be a reflection of the same phenomenon, but at least what we see is that these groups are different, even at this level, which makes it interesting. Doesn't explain a lot, but it makes it interesting. And we can see the same when we look at children's emotions as function of temperamental differences. Just quickly showing that when we look at children's emotions across a task, from the beginning to the end, we could see similar differences and trends. Kids with high inhibition sensitivity started always slightly more negative in a new situation, but it balanced away over time. But the key issue is here, the same with positive things. Started lower with positive emotions, but reached the level of the other group. But the key here is that imagine that the kids go through these situations repeatedly throughout the day, throughout the week, throughout the years. And if they every time experience it slightly more negatively, that must have a toll. So to conclude the whole package of different kinds of results, which of course you can't digest in one presentation, I would argue that goals of building and increasing competence are associated with well-being beliefs that support learning, whereas goals of validating and demonstrating competence are associated with ill-being and beliefs that impede learning. This still doesn't explain why, or it doesn't as such help very much us to create learning environments that would get rid of this difference, but still it's important distinction. So I'm not sure about the background of you people, but I think this applies to all of us. But the challenge in our work is how can we promote well-being without sacrificing, well-doing without sacrificing well-being. So if you have an answer to that, I'd be happy to hear. And now I hope my Google translator was correct when I said thank you. And that's my team currently, so thank you very much. Sorry about the rush. I prepared an hour, but I didn't want to leave anything out. So.
Markku, thank you for your presentation. And we checked that there are questions that arrived online, and in order not to disconnect your computer, you will see the questions here. Maybe some of them require some replay of the presentation. So the floor is yours again.
Okay, there's a Finnish question. Somebody surprised me. Yes, it is possible to have the presentation of the material, the references. I will provide that. Just write me an email. I'd be happy to provide you with information. You didn't instruct to make any simple questions? Okay, one, you probably see the questions if you're online. Yeah, I could imagine that it also depends on situation, whether these different student groups respond differently. As already shown, if the condition is task-focused, there's no difference in the reaction, more or less. So it makes a difference. We haven't done experimental research enough to see what sort of conditions work and how they influence and what the key factors are. We've seen that, for example, the level of concreteness in instruction influences already the similar, or results already in similar differences. So there are different instructional factors or conditional factors that might contribute to that, but we're in the first steps of doing that. Very difficult task to do it because we would like to simulate the authentic learning environment, which is very difficult. You can do it in the lab, but that's not the reality in the same way. Of course, it's interesting from this research point of view, but not the same. But I would really claim that there's a big difference in those components. As to the advice, I am very cautious about giving any advice to practitioners, again, because we don't know that well. We haven't done that sort of research where we would introduce an intervention, for example, or try different pedagogical structuring or instructions or learning environment. But I would guess, based on what we know from research, that if you can reduce social comparison and the kind of competition that refers to social comparison, especially downward comparison, I think you might reduce at least the effects of those tendencies. I'm not sure whether, because these orientations are surprisingly stable. So the first question would be, could we sort of change the student's orientation? And I think that would be very tricky because it's partly, I would imagine, based on those biological differences, our sensitivities and the way we react to the environments. So that would be very difficult to get rid of. We can direct, of course, to sort of support certain types of tendencies. And we can probably do that even though we can't touch very well those fundamental differences. But I would rather think about how we can create an environment where those certain tendencies don't need to become active. As again, I use the example that I showed. If the task was a very simple difference, if the instruction was task-focused, the effect was basically non-existent. So if we can sort of strive towards that, which is very difficult because our educational game, school game, is full of tests and exams and comparison and rankings and all that kind of things that I'm not a very fan of from a motivational perspective. I understand the relevance and importance, but I think they have a toll. It's a very tricky question for me that refers to the levels in relation to teacher competence and pedagogical innovativeness. I'd like to have some clarification on that. But of course, who could deny teacher competence? But I think what we, at least in Finland, what we see is teacher would like to have more knowledge on these differences. I'm surprised when I talk to teachers, which is the most difficult audience in the world because they know everything. When you try to introduce something from research, they're very skeptical, but quite often when we talk about these sort of differences, they relate to that. They say, oh yeah, I know a student just like that, and another student just like that. And that makes them think, okay, perhaps I could sort of meet the students in a slightly different way. I understand it's an impossible task to adjust teaching or the instructional practices to each and every student, but still to understand something about those differences might help to organize the classroom in that way. So I would like to see, in terms of teacher competence, more understanding of individual student differences in motivation and the dynamics of motivation. It's not just about autonomy, for example. It's not just about competence. There are a lot of other important factors in play. And perhaps the learning environment, especially using technology, might help to do that. I actually had a grant application on a project where we wanted to personalize student activities. The response, the review was kind of interesting. It said, this study definitely needs to be done in Finland, but we're not going to give you any money. So I guess it's relevant, but doesn't get you any funding. But I think that might be one way to approach that, to create an environment that supports personalized learning paths. Again, a huge challenge and links to teacher competence in the sense that I think, at least again in Finland, if you look at where the teachers are struggling the most is their skills in modern technology. So in order to create a personalized learning environment, I think you need a lot of work from different groups of people, experts in that area. But I think they're linked together. Again, whatever kind of solution reduces certain processes and activities in the classroom might be beneficial. And again, some other practices that enhance and support the other activities. Please, if I don't answer your question, which is very likely, as I said, this is very stressful, I'm getting exhausted, just clarify your question.
I think the online questions have already been addressed.
Yeah.
So there is still some time for on-site questions.
There's one more important question referring to gender differences. I think that's a good point. Well, yeah, gender differences. Yes, we find systematic gender differences, but not very strong. It would seem that girls across the age, even cultures, are slightly more master-oriented, and the boys are slightly more performance-focused, which I think is very stereotypical. But then we also find some interesting discrepancies from there in certain countries. For example, if I remember correctly, in Norway, girls were way more the level of girls' performance avoidance goals were way higher than guys. So it would seem that in their culture, girls are more sensitive to that sort of information, failure in front of the others. So there are systematic differences, but they're not big. I would say 3 to 6% in terms of explained variance. Trying to recall some others. But they don't begin in the very early ages. They only start when they learn the game.
I wonder whether it works. Dr. Bados, I'm sorry not using the application. I'm always worried about things that separate people from direct interaction. And I think of the famous title, All This Useless Beauty, by Elvis Costello. That was one sentence. The second, I'm very grateful to you because you showed some hidden similarities, Finno-Ugrian culture in students, like laziness, cynicism, etc. I do apologize about this. But now I come up with a question. In that one, in your research, you actually illustrated time as situations, one thing's coming after each other. That goes back to Greek philosophy, isn't it? In a way. That is very nice, of course, we know that. My question is about the emotions. You also deal with emotions. How could you actually project time or anything to this psychologically? How long? Or you didn't really pay attention to this question. How long can I be something like rejecting or refusing things? Or how long does it take to change? Does it show in your research? That's the question.
So you're referring to the fluctuation in emotion
Yes.
states? Yeah, I'm very happy about that question because I think the main stream of research in educational psychology on emotions now focus on what they call achievement emotions, which are like trait emotions. And for me, that's even a difficult concept to really grasp. For me, emotions are situational fluctuations. Of course, we're simplifying our view on that. And I don't have a definite answer to you in that sense, because all what we have done is that we have snapshots of students' rated level of the intensity of specific emotions, but we don't know the extent of that. So it's partly artificial that we do in terms of plotting a change over time, but I think it's a valid description of the fluctuation in those snapshots. But I think your question refers to more like how that would require a slightly different design that we haven't implemented. But very relevant question in terms of what we could do in order to understand better the dynamics. I'd be happy to direct that idea further to perhaps some new PhD students. Had any insights into that? Would you have? No? Yeah. But nevertheless, what I really wanted to point out is I think that sort of approach is more fruitful, more informational in terms of the dynamics than the sort of trait perspective that is very common. not sure what they refer to. Perhaps there's somebody in the audience who does research on that. No? Okay.
There is time for one last question.
The last question is always the
And you have one further month to ask online, Markku, provided he will read the forum.
Yeah, I have nothing else to do.
So as a concluding remark of this session, thank you for the presentation. And I could realize what is expected from a university professor. Not only teaches, but inspires. So thank you for the inspiration you gave us.
Thank you. I got the chills. Thank you.